Huh. Nosferatu: The Wrath of Malachi is an oldie of a game title originally published in 2003. The game being the somewhat competent yet still forgotten child of a cursed family owned by Swedish game developer Idle Effects. It being one of the more competent titles of their short 5 to 6 game build that took on the survival horror first-person shooter direction. Now, I like to search for obscure games because the current mainstream just doesn't interest me anymore, with a lot of games thrust to the sidelines or forgotten to history being a genuine breath of fresh air. An opportunity to find hidden gems or ideas with potential not executed well. The paragraph being a roundabout 200 IQ way to say I basically browse GOG a lot. The game had a lot going for it too. Classic monster movie aesthetic and vibe with this Dracula Nosferatu gothic horror worn clearly on its sleeve. Plus, it's rather brief, meaning it doesn't outstay its welcome and lacks padding, with one other bell and whistle that thrusts its metaphorical fist into the section of my mind that usually doesn't give a shit about game features that are haphazardly thrust on the back of the box. And that being a part of, now brace yourselves for this, random generation. Hold your tired wings and feigned interest as I can already hear the tired slurp of your eyes glazing over. Oh look, another game that has random generation, I hear you say. It's not like there's an entire current genre of them where the entire mechanic is based on that concept alone, mumble mumble snark snark. And honestly, I wouldn't be above snarking alongside you, seemingly weary and jaded viewer of my gaming content. But there's the inherent and somewhat novel aspect to it that reveals itself in the details. This game was published in 2003. Now, I'm not sure about you Zoomers if you managed to get past the first 15 seconds of this video. Even though I'm a part of the very same generation, being born in 2000, that concept just wasn't done back then. Or at least not as eyeball-fuckingly done to death as it is nowadays, and reserved solely for the quote-unquote games that had the GUI of fucking Windows ME after a floppy hangover. But unnecessary harping aside, the game offered an inherent replay value that didn't fall into the personal loathsome genre of roguelikes, that still had legitimate single-player linear progression, but tossed around here or there with a different placement of NPCs and events that kept you on your toes, not commonly associated with games at the time. So, grabbing my spelunking hat, already aware of the somewhat checkered history of the company behind the game and their habit of taking on too many gaming projects that led to a general lack of polish. Now, I'll come back to that later. I dove right in to see the game's potential, seeing as if the game had an air of actually having a favorable reception at its release. Right up from the top, the game happens to show its age, but takes the classic shooter approach with an amazing ability to somehow find ways to make things incredibly awkward with its lack of widescreen. Fair enough, based on this game's age. However, in the description, I'll link the widescreen fix for you that allows you to play in 1080p. Unlike modern shooters, the classic focuses a lot more on the steady acquisition of different weapons, starting off with a fencing sword for one, which was already somewhat interesting compared to any other starting weapon, but distinguishes itself with what seems like an early implementation of a stamina system. The more you swing your sword or move and take damage, the slower and tired the character becomes, making it harder for them to skirt out of fights after getting his teeth knackered in like the schoolboy who reminds the teachers of to do homework. The sniveling sod. Even so, you also get the good gothic horror weapons of a holy crucifix, a few flintlock pistols, your fists, a holy chalice sprinkled with holy water, a couple of stakes, muskets, revolver, and eventually the big dick wahey machine gun. At least he gets points for being in touch with the time period of the game anyway, sticking with the gothic aesthetic. Apart from that, it's pretty fair to say, and kind of a given, for a standard first-person shooter, where instead of the modern regenerating health, the game forces you to put on your big boy pants and find medkits like your great-grandfather did. What, are you some sort of soft-coddled child? Your great-grandfather strode through the beaches of Normandy with only deliberately placed medkits around like a man when he was your age, the game clearly chides you for. But even so, it fits incredibly well with the survival horror aspect to a degree. Almost disgustingly so, as it scrambled my brain just how well suited that classic shooter style works well with survival horror, especially as you're restricted a lot with your ammo and eventually have to take the damage by getting close, or when the monsters decide to ambush you and leave you for dead on the metaphorical road, like the town drunk after having a drinking contest with a whale with legs. Even so, the main goal of the short game is very clear from the beginning. You're in the Count's castle and he's kidnapped your family, friends, and extended family, all of them locked up and lost in different parts of the castle, taking a bit of an unexpected Metroidvania turn too. Your goal being to go from East Wing to West Wing to the main castle, traveling through every room and searching every nook and cranny for them, alongside keys that allow you to access different parts of the estate that all connect to each other too in some way. While I fucking hate to say this comparison and wish I can already hear myself hurling internally, it takes the Dark Souls approach of an interconnected world, with no map mind you, which in a way was a welcome surprise. You didn't think of the place as a strewn about mishmash of locations. No, the game forced you to think as if you were in an actual estate and home where you logically think about your environment as if it was real life. And not just something to shut your brain off thanks to the often automatic game logic we've been conditioned to play games as nowadays. Oh, and of course, after finding your second cousin twice removed, you then escort them back to the main entrance. Many would already be tired of the idea of escorting people back to safety, but most of the time you already cleared the way to help take them anyway. But there's also an incentive as saving them allows them to open their luggage trunks and give you a power-up, ability, or even a weapon each time. And the more you bring them back, the more things you'll get that'll actually be useful and help you out. I mean, there's nothing like saving your rambunctious grandpa after he was helping you fight a demon with his fists, making your way back towards the rest of the gang with his larger-than-life attitude and giving you a fucking machine gun. God damn, Grandpa, you're both a badass, and helped make my game easier, since I could now mow down enemies in every encounter since I collected tons of ammo littered around the area before I even had the weapon. Now, of course, now the idea of random generation comes in, because apart from a few key members, the location of the people you're trying to save can be randomly generated, meaning that no playthrough is inherently the same, but also how enemies don't stay dead either, meaning that if you've already cleared a room ages ago, more enemies can creep in and bat you in their face with their smug elation as you sprawl in surprise, leaving you in an atmosphere where nowhere is completely safe. Pair that with your limited resources, there will be times where you're gonna have to fight them close to close and pray to God that your already low health won't kill you here, where every medkit counts. One interesting main mechanic the game brings though is the fact that the game counts down to midnight, where each family member is bound to be captured and sacrificed by Nosferatu, Dracula, for his ritual at specific times. Meaning that if you don't save them quickly, you'll no longer have access to the important items they can offer you, and gets you closer to the failure state. Pair that with the fact, once you hit midnight, the game gets harder, you have your work cut out for you. Lose more than half of your family and it's game over, but it's possible to save all of them. The game giving you an incentive to be fast, but not too cautious as you're given a clock, forcing you to progress and face the horror the game presents, otherwise you'll fail. Even so, most of the time your game is spent locating keys to access different parts of the estate, deal with boss vampires and lesser vampires that are helping the Count, and using stakes to impale the bastards. Here's the thing, the boss encounter isn't over after you beat them. No, after that you need to find their coffin located at an important place to stop them from healing their wounds, narratively of course, where you then must find them lying in their coffins and stick them through, often leaving behind important progression keys and lore on the world alongside bestiary pages and how to deal with specific monsters and providing subtle hints on how to deal with later bosses. Gameplay wise, the game is already solid as is, although the game has its interesting quirks where anytime the music goes into full blast horror mode, it's letting you know that enemies are nearby. And there have been personally amusing scenarios where I've killed enemies on a spiral staircase leading upwards. The game's atmosphere being spooky with ambient horror and sounds, only to then get the full violin treatment when I approach a door. But here's the thing, while enemies will follow you through doors if you run, they seldom open doors to get at you, if you haven't entered a room yet. Meaning that one of the sneaky sods was spawned in at the bottom of the tower again and is making their way towards me as I wait patiently upstairs, already assured I'll win, channeling my inner Obi-Wan because I have the high ground which can be easily exploited with the enemy pathing. Here's a quick tip kids, plan on fighting the boss fights or enemies fairly? Don't. If you can find a way to stick them on objects making them unable to path their way past it, but you are capable of hitting them and exploiting their hitbox, just do it. That's how I beat every boss save for like 3 of them, which really helped save resources that helped me fuck up the final boss like the punk ass bitch he is. Now I won't be rather remiss in stating the fact that the game's story is minimal. After all, a 4-hour game focused primarily on shooting and the ability to go shoot bang at the dark things in the night can be somewhat contrived. The story, while minimal, does the job well and is somewhat interesting. The devs, who watched nothing but classic Dracula movies in its black and white glory while eating Cheerios in blankets, being well transferred to the setting. The plot is a version of Bram Stoker's Dracula with clear visual inspiration from F.W. Murnau's Solus. I mean, heck, you only have to look at the artwork of the game and the boss itself to realize that the legally distinct label does not apply. Our protagonist James Patterson is traveling to Transylvania, being a son of a wealthy noble family and world-class fencer, having just lost at the said competition in Sweden. In turn, his loss was convenient enough to allow him to make his sister's wedding, hoping to arrive a day later for the initial meeting and being able to still partake in the preparation and reunite with the family. But when he arrives at Castle Malachi, something seems wrong. He discovers that his future brother-in-law is a vampire who has taken his family members in custody. Now James must save them all before it's too late. He first recovers his trusty silver cane sword because, back then you wouldn't be fucked over by the TSA or considered a weeb for having a custom sword. No, I'm not bitter or anything. And decides to plunder the place to rescue his family members while picking up notes that reveals the nature of the creatures that inhabit the area and the developing sinister plot. The Romanian Count Orlok and his future brother-in-law are apparently subscribing to the evil bad guy motivation number 1 designation Alpha, that being resurrecting the bigger and more evil big bad guy to wreak havoc on humanity known as Lord Malachi, apparently needing the blood of James' sister Angelica and his family for apparently her aristocratic virginal blood. Jesus Christ, I hope that's a sentence I'm never going to get quoted on. Eventually, James saves who he can based on your competency and ability to wage a one-man war through the castle with Doomslayer proportions, defeating his vampire friends like his Edgar Allan Poe lookalike friend that he keeps around for edgy 14-year-old Twitter clout, his 2 succubus side pieces, and the grotesque big tough abomination that he and his family keep in the basement and never talk about. Although the Count guy is still a little bit on the dumb spectrum. When you reach the Count, apparently the ritual takes a somewhat archaic approach where apparently the Count was supposed to sacrifice himself to bring about Malachi. He probably must have wanted to end the suffering of being invited to horror conventions for being a clear Nosferatu lookalike and getting cease and desisted every few fucking minutes. Mate, I'm not sure about you, but if I was an immortal vampire, I'd have spent more of it bringing about the KnunPlus New World Order, establishing the great and strong regime where everyone subscribed to me on YouTube and rule the world with an iron fist, instead of resurrecting an ancient evil that'll make things much less fun. You're basically asking for the annoying middle manager to show up, but whatever floats your boat there, mate. Even so, each of the family members and friends you save, while minimal, do have distinct personalities with memorable delivery with that old, aristocratic, stiff upper lip delivery that can be somewhat endearing based on who you save. But that's pretty much it. Well, there's not really much to say here. It's not that great, and in 2003 at the time, the graphics weren't considered good either. However, I'm one of those weird mutants grown in a vat that isn't necessarily bothered by older graphics. Although probably unintentionally, the uncanny valley that comes from the models does elicit a greater fear in me compared to modern horror games. Of course, another one of those odd reasons in which I can handle most horror games with a vaguely blasé attitude, but freak out at the sight of the unfinished blocky amalgamations imitating people in games like System Shock 2. Yet the illicit fear that came from such creatures didn't really affect me either, which in a way could be a knock against the game, which is why it's focused on having enemies that can return to a room you cleared, focused highly on surprise like busting through roofs, windows, and hiding in dark corners, adds to the fear factor a lot more. Analytical cap off, or at least turn to the side like a chaff twat, the animations are certainly as blocky as a Lego playset on the weapon front. Other creatures are given more attention, while the whole first-person weapons are given an almost animatic visual feel. The animation certainly taken the major keyframes of motion with barely any in-between frames, that while I might have attempted to elicit a sense of a fast swing motion, feels like a disjointed slideshow, especially with the cane sword. But alas, considering the fact that this game was made alongside 3 other games at the same time, all published in the same year mind you by the same developers, they clearly didn't work on polish as much due to the scattershot approach to game development, which did not help them in the long run. Again, Matt's What Happened video really does go into much greater detail on the company's style of developing games. You should probably check that out. But once again, lighting and atmosphere saves this game so much more in making it a visual worm that lodges itself tightly in the back of your head, where the urge to drink myself to sleep is located because of its illicit visual style and gothic aesthetic. If anything, there is a cause for annoyance for some people as it puts a grainy old film filter over the entire game, probably to elicit the idea of being in a classic horror movie that really did work in tone and atmosphere, lighting and music, but let's not mince words. It's also a very clear filter to hide the texture work and inefficiencies. Don't try to hide it. The more you try to hide something, the more it points it out. Which is why my ability to not set off red flags when any relationship prospects look in my general direction often find themselves in a body bag when they ask too many questions. So this is where I supposedly start talking about the great musical soundtrack that elicits a sense of dread, or more somewhat pretentious claims meant to both sound smart and influence you like a Pied Piper. But apart from the atmospheric sounds, there's just not much there. The game's lack of sound, mind you, uses atmospheric sounds and looping themes well, but is why this review unusually has much less background music compared to every other video, just because there are only 7 tracks total, the longest being 2 minutes and the shortest being 4 seconds. I'm probably gonna have to nick some other music from other games just for this video. How can I comment on something that's inherently minimal? Now sure, the composer did a bang up job of eliciting that classic monster movie vampire vibe that you'd hear in an old gothic movie. Extraordinarily well, actually, where I could probably overlay one of its songs over some old footage if I could get away with it. Hopefully the YouTube copyright Eldritch God will only leech off my will to live if I'm lucky enough to get away with it, but just listen. Like shit, the music in its quiet tones keeps you bloody tense, in which it then starts getting the sharp and eerie violin strings of horror when an enemy smashes through a window, or breaks through the cardboard floorboards with enough power to make the Kool-Aid Man blush. It gets the heart pumping for a bit. Even so, the game was a quaint experience that was a pleasure to play through. It doesn't take too long, and a genuinely fun and classic horror shooter that executes the horror much greater than any modern legitimate horror first-person shooter has tried in recent times. Pair that with the nifty design mechanic of slight shifts in layout and placement of family members, alongside the time-ticking mechanic, it leads to a generally enjoyable experience where you can vary between saving everyone or only capable of saving the minimum by the skin of your teeth that doesn't activate the game over screen, varying on your drive to action, ability to rely on your navigational memory, and general timidness. It generally serves as a personal motivation and point system for internal satisfaction that can determine how difficult your playthrough can also get too extrinsically, while your ending also takes into account your ability to beat the final boss. That is, if you haven't got the resources to actually beat the guy based on how many people you save. There's a genuine consequence for not saving people, as the power-ups, abilities, weapons, and stat boosters they give you can make both your playthrough harder and make you weaker in the face of the final boss. Of course, the game taking the 2 timeline approach where there's an ending for if you succeed against Malachi, or even if you brave the castle and all its vampires, but still fall short against the true big bad. Is it a good game? Yeah, it is. And of course, the only game from Idle Effects I'll ever play. Oh dear God. Anyway, I'm KnunPlus. Thanks for watching.